She carried her day in a burlap sack and a small, stubborn hope. 3 oranges, a folded photograph of her mother wrapped in tissue, and a handful of coins that rattled like a question. The street smelled of dust and frying oil. The sun leaned hard on the tin roofs. Mary walked with the careful hurry of a child who had learned to move between work and hiding, between a mother's cough and the dignity of a small, steady gait. If this video touched you, please like and subscribe. Stay until the end and tell us in the comments where you think courage turned the tide. It helps others find stories like this one. Mary stopped in front of the mansion like a sudden, misplaced bird. A wrought iron gate barred the sidewalk, ornate and cold. Beyond it, the garden was a small, deliberate wilderness. Clipped hedges, a fountain, the promise of distance from everything she knew. She tucked the oranges deeper into the sack with both hands and raised her knuckles to the gate. Her palm was small, the metal was cool and smooth. A woman opened the door in a neat uniform, hair gathered in a way that said the house ran on routines. Mrs. Chen looked down at Mary with the patient, slightly surprised look of someone who saw a stray thing and had to decide whether to return it to the street or take it in for a moment. "What are you selling, child?" she asked, voice soft with the restraint that served a large house. "Oranges," Mary said. Her voice held the plainness of someone who had practiced requests. Behind her, a remembered cough, Clara's, pressed at her chest like a borrowed weight. "Please, miss, my mama needs medicine." Mrs. Chen glanced past the courtyard and into the glass doors of the house, where the marble hall brightened like ice. "How old are you?" she asked. 9, Mary said. She said it like an offering, the number small and final. Mrs. Chen hesitated the length of a single breath and, with the gentleness of habit, stepped aside enough for the child to pass under the shadow of the portico. The foyer was cooler than the street. The marble reflected the day in thin, indifferent sheets. A piano sat like a polished ship, and the walls bore frames, faces whose eyes seemed to hold the quiet business of wealth. Mary's bare shoes made no sound. Her oranges, held against her chest, smelled of sun and a sweetness that belonged to a different life. She kept her eyes down until she reached the parlor. There, on a side table, in a frame with thin gold filigree, was a photograph that stopped her breath. The woman in the photo was young, hair like spilled chestnuts, laughing with her head tilted in a way Mary recognized without ever having seen it before. It was not a face that looked like the woman who coughed in their one-room apartment, who wrapped cardboard around a mattress and colored a child's hair into braids. It was the same features turned outward, the slope of a brow, the crookedness of a smile. Mary touched the glass as if the warmth might travel through. "Mama?" she whispered, though she had never seen that face in a camera before, only in memory and the current lines around the bed. At that moment, the doors at the far end opened, and a man crossed the threshold like someone who carried the silence of many empty rooms. He was tall, methodical in his steps, the weight of long searching in the way his shoulders lifted. Marcus stopped when he saw the child, and then the picture. Recognition arrived in him not like a strike, but like something folding closed, a soft, impossible certainty. The photo had been in a box he had kept unopened for a decade, one of the small rebellions of hope he allowed himself. He had searched, sent notes, hired people. Names had vanished like footprints in rain. He had found traces, an address, a rumor, and then nothing. Seeing the woman in the frame again, and seeing the girl whose fingers pressed against the glass, returned a name and a geography all at once. "Who is she?" Mary asked, looking up. The question was raw, immediate, the way a child asks because not remembering is a sharp thing. Marcus's jaw moved, slow, as he reached into a pocket and produced a folded bill like a tool. He flattened it between his fingers and, almost clumsily, offered it. "Take this," he said. His voice carried a careful, private astonishment. "Take it back to your mother. Tell her to call this number." He wrote the number on the back of a visiting card, the kind with a heavy weight and clean type. He added an address, brief and precise, as if distance could be answered with a place to begin. Mary blinked. The $100 felt huge in her small hands. It smelled faintly of ink and possibility. "But," she began, because a child knows the arithmetic of estrangement in a different currency. "You have to tell her," Marcus said, and for a breath he looked like a man who had forgotten how demanding the world could be. "Tell her Marcus is waiting. Tell her I've been looking." On the walk back, the city pressed around Mary. A woman sweeping, a boy bicycling too fast, an old man listing a grocery cart like a small, contained life. She clutched the bill and the card against her chest. The apartment door opened to the same thin ribbon of light and the same cough that climbed like wind through rafters. Clara sat on the mattress, thinner than the photo, her hands bony and freckled from years of work. The cough had the rasp of someone who had kept it inside for too long. When Mary showed the card, Clara stared until the room tilted. Her voice, when it came, was a small thing. "Where did you get that?" Mary told the story fast, cutting out nothing. The gate, Mrs. Chen, the parlor, the picture, Marcus's face, like a found answer. Clara's hands trembled at the edges of the card, as if touching a life she had thought boxed away years ago. The call that followed was hesitant, full of the cautious politeness of a person re-entering an old house whose owner might have changed the locks. Marcus's voice on the line was low and careful, the sound of someone who had rehearsed very little and let the truth be his only script. "Clara?" he said, and her name landed like a familiar coin. Her story came out in fragments, the pressure to disappear, the whispered threats from Catherine, fear for a child yet unborn long ago, choices made in the dark to hide rather than fight. There were pauses where the words failed and the cough filled the white space. Marcus listened and measured, and in him something practical took hold. He insisted she come to a hospital, private, close, where talk could become treatment. And he promised to be there. "We'll get you well," he said. "We'll do the tests. We'll find out everything." He did not speak as a man who could fix every damage. He spoke as one who would not let danger sit unchallenged in his family. They moved with an awkward, sudden efficiency that surprised Clara. Marcus arranged for a car, for a hospital room, with a pale bed and curtains that kept the noise out. Dr. Peterson, who had the steady patience of someone accustomed to emergencies and the language of recovery, examined Clara and said the clinical words that hung like weather. Severe respiratory infection, signs of malnutrition. With antibiotics and proper fluids, she has a good chance, he said. His voice had the authority of someone who had seen nights turn into mornings. But she needs antibiotic treatment and nourishment. We'll monitor. We'll do a DNA test while she is here. It may take a few days." Mary sat on a chair that did not quite fit her and watched a man who had been a stranger hours before stride up and down the hospital corridor, calling, arranging, smoothing. Marcus did not hover. Instead, he worked, like someone building a safe place around the three people in the room. He signed forms, answered questions with the precision of someone whose world was governed by appointments and schedules. But his eyes kept returning to Clara with a softness that did not know how to hide. The DNA test was brief and clinical. A swab of the inside of Mary's cheek, a swab of Clara's, sent off with the clean briskness of laboratory routine. Waiting was an ache that pooled into the small hours. Marcus stayed in the chair, hands clasped, while Mary dozed and Clara slept with the soft rise and fall of someone letting a horizon steady beneath her chest. When the result came, as promised, it came with statistical bluntness. 99.9%, a number that made rooms change color. Marcus read it like a priest reading a text. The certainty reconfigured how everyone stood in the space of the hospital. The first meeting after the result was tidy with the strange politeness of big shifts. Marcus and Clara facing each other across a bed, their shared history unspooling in the spaces between sentences.
Clara apologized for the ways her fear had pushed her into hiding, for the years of absence that had become a kind of exile. Marcus apologized for searching too late, for letting his pride and Catherine's pressure shape decisions that hardened into silence. Their confessions were small, honest things. Two people who had been hurt, making room for the fact that hurt had been multiplied by miscommunication and fear. Catherine came to the hospital because she could not sleep from the tremor of it all. When she arrived, she carried herself as a woman used to being listened to on command. A tailored coat, the faint scent of something expensive, a posture that had never been asked to bend. Her eyes flicked across the room at Mary, at Clara's thin hands, at Marcus, an inventory before the accounting began. The confrontation that followed was not loud but precise. Marcus set limits in a tone that was neither shouted nor broken. "You threatened her," he said. "You forced her away. That cannot be undone, but it must be owned." Catherine's defenses fell in the small ways that time makes possible. A tremor in a lip, the exhaustion of a voice that has always been on the side of reputation rather than reconciliation. She had always believed her control was protection of the family's name. Now she saw the cost of that protection. Her apology was brittle at first, then softer. "I was afraid," she said, which was both an explanation and a confession. When Clara asked the question everyone had been circling, why had she done it, Catherine named shame, social fear, and the terrible arithmetic of class. Marcus listened, and in his listening there was a new authority. He would not let fear decide again. The confrontation did not end in cinematic absolution. Catherine offered quiet, conditional gestures toward repair. She would step back from certain decisions. She would attend therapy. She would publicly acknowledge the wrong. Marcus, careful and clear, accepted the gestures as a start. He insisted on concrete boundaries. Catherine would no longer have unilateral control over family matters. Decisions would be shared. He would not erase the past, but he would not let the past define their future. Clara's recovery was slow, the kind of healing that maps itself with small facts. Appetite returning, cough easing, a night with no fever. Mary learned to set the tray lid on the table by habit, to fold napkins with the gravity of someone making order. Marcus brought things no one had thought to bring before. A slow blender for soups, a basket of fresh fruit that made Mary's palms ache with the memory of the orange sack. He sat on the edge of the bed sometimes and read aloud, not because he believed stories cured illness, but because the sound of words fixed them in place. "You're stubborn," he told Clara one afternoon when she smiled, a half-breath of triumph, and she answered, "So were you."
Neighbors who had watched Clara and Mary from a distance came to see how things went. Mrs. Chen arrived with a tray of tea and a look at combined ownership with relief. She had been a steward of the house for years and had watched its rhythms. Now she watched the family rearrange themselves into new patterns. Dr. Peterson stopped by to check charts and to smile at Mary like one of the many adults who had learned to love the child without either knowledge or claim. Days later, in a compact clinic lab with a window that showed a sliver of sky, the DNA report was discussed again, this time with the formal language doctors use when facts are no longer theory. The number, 99.9%, hummed against the walls like a bell. The legal side of things began to move. Paperwork and gentle consultations about guardianship and rights and the practicalities of blending money and family. Marcus was exacting about the future. He wanted everything done in a way that would not be humiliating for Clara, that respected her privacy and her agency. He did not want charity. He wanted partnership. The wound in their story had left its mark on each of them in different ways. For Mary, the world widened. She learned to sleep without the sound of Clara's cough as an alarm clock, and she learned to stake small claims on a life that gave more than it took. For Clara, the healing was not only physical, it was the slow repair of trust. "I thought I was protecting you," she told Mary one evening, fingers combing a child's hair, "but I was also hiding from myself." Mary's answer was the simple, perfect judgment of a child. "You kept us alive." Marcus and Clara's reconciliation moved past hospitals into the better awkwardness of learning to live with one another. They ate at a table that was not quite theirs yet, negotiated morning routines, shared the small humiliations of first steps back into intimacy. The mansion, which had once been an island of ordered quiet for Marcus, began to make space for noise. The clatter of bowls, the faint music of a radio in the kitchen, the shuffle of small feet across marble. Mrs. Chen rearranged the breakfast routine with a decisive hand that invited rather than ordered Mary into the morning. Catherine's involvement took shape as a hesitant apprenticeship in humility. She came to the small family dinners, often late and with a caution that was almost shy. She would ask small, practical questions about what help was needed, and then let others choose. The hard edges of her authority softened under the slow pressure of being required to apologize and to return account. Marcus set the terms: public acknowledgement and private support for Clara in rebuilding a life on equal footing. Catherine complied, which in itself was an odd kind of penance. Her apology was not a dramatic unveiling, but a series of small, steady acts: paying for therapy sessions, attending mediation, learning the resentment of the past cannot be undone with one florid gesture. É passado e imalabável. Spring came, and their lives rearranged to map itself around steadier patterns. Marcus proposed. There was no cinematic kneeling in a garden, only a conversation at the kitchen table over tepid coffee, grown from different places and the soft morning light blinking on glassware. "Will you marry me?" he asked.
which was less a question about ceremony and more an offering of legal and emotional safety. Clara looked at him, at Mary sitting between them, and then back at the wedding card in her hand. There were no illusions. The past had been heavy, the future precarious. But marriage, in that moment, was a promise to face all of it together. The wedding was small. Mrs. Chen arranged flowers with the care of someone who knows how to make meaning from stems and ribbon. Dr. Peterson joked about the timing, as if healing could be stamped with calendar dates. Catherine attended, standing at the edge like a woman learning a new posture of humility. Mary wore a borrowed dress that made her feel like she'd transformed into her own hope. The fabric felt strange and wonderful against her skin. The orange of the fruit that had been her ward slipped into a pocket as a private talisman. They moved, slowly and without fanfare, into the mansion as a family. The house kept its marble and hush, but now the halls absorbed laughter and the clumsiness of someone learning the rhythm of shared life. Mary took to arranging the oranges in a bowl on the kitchen table, as if placing the day's work where it could be celebrated rather than hidden. On the parlor wall, near the old photograph that had started everything, Marcus placed a new frame, a picture of the three of them together, messy hair and unbuttoned collars, smiles made in the light of a shared room. The old photograph of young Clara sat beside the new one, a pair that told a story of continuity rather than replacement. Years later, the photograph motif remained a gentle spine through their life. The old picture was not erased. It became a testament to the girl Clara had once been and the choices she made when fear sought to decide for her. The new photo, taken in a garden heavy with light, recorded the imperfect, ongoing repair of family. There were hospital checkups that became less urgent and more routine. Nights where Mary's cough, once the alarm, was now a memory catalogued under "Overcome." Catherine learned to listen, not perfectly, but in ways that mattered. On an ordinary afternoon that smelled of lemons and sun, Marcus found himself in the parlor with both frames on the table. He ran a finger along the edge of the new picture, and then the old. The city hummed beyond the gates. He had wealth he had not wanted to make the measure of worth. He had also learned the cost of letting pride keep people apart. He met Clara's hand, and she squeezed it, a small, private alignment. Mary padded in, orange in hand, and put it in the bowl with a solemnity that Marcus laughed quietly. "Why did you bring me here?"
Mary asked once, and the innocence of the question made the answer as simple as light. "To belong," Marcus said. He looked at Clara, and she nodded. "To belong." Catherine, working in the garden with gloves none of them had thought to ask her to wear before, paused and looked up. The house did not feel owned by one person alone now. It contained mistakes and apologies like furniture that had been rearranged, a different, awkward comfort. There were still moments when the past pressed at them. A letter arrived from someone who remembered different versions of the story. A neighbor offered a look of judgment that required no reply. But the central axis had shifted. Where fear had once drawn the map, now accountability and love redrew the borders. They were not healed in a fairy tale way. Healing, they learned, was more often a series of small agreements to keep trying. On quiet nights, when the house exhaled, Mary would run her fingers along the frame of the old photograph and then along the new one. The two images made a hinge for her life,
a past that explained and a present that promised. She had been 9 when she knocked on a gate with 3 oranges and a folded photograph. She grew into someone who understood that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it was a sustained, soft insistence on being seen and loved. When asked later what turned the tide, people would point to the photograph, or the DNA result, or Marcus's money. Mary would answer, simply, with the confidence of someone who had learned how to place oranges into bowls and hope into hands. He finally listened. Their story moved through those who watched like a small, steady lesson. Love, they discovered, required both the bravery to seek and the humility to be sought. It required people willing to name harm and willing to be changed by the naming. It did not erase mistakes, but it offered repair, a way to live between the frames of what had been and what could be. The parlor wall became a kind of altar of memory and progress. The old photograph and the new one leaned side by side, their glass faces catching the light differently, but both honest. Beneath them, an orange was placed each morning, a small ritual that said sweetness can return if you tend it. Outside, the gate remained, wrought and ornamental. Children still sold fruit on the street, and Mrs. Chen still swept the steps as if making the day's border. Inside, the house felt lived in. Clara's cough faded into rhythms of health. Marcus learned how to stand as someone who protected rather than controlled. Catherine learned the delicate, practical work of offering recompense, sometimes clumsy, sometimes sincere. Mary grew in both size and surety, an emblem of a life that had been saved from erasure. Their healing did not end neatly. There were hospital follow-ups and uncomfortable conversations and practical mornings where tiredness made patience thin.
But they learned that the essential thing was to keep each other close enough to name what hurt and strong enough to fix what could be fixed. The photograph that had once been a question, "Why was my mother's picture in your mansion?" became an answer that asked for new questions. How do we care for one another now? What will we do with the second chance? Their lives offered small, ordinary answers. Meals shared, apologies made, boundaries observed, laughter allowed. And in the parlor, every day, the 2 photographs reminded them of the arc they had traveled. Fear folded into hope, a life of hiding transformed into a life of being held. The bowl of oranges on the table gleamed like a promise, and Mary, older in ways the years could measure and younger in the ways that matter most, kept arranging them one by one, learning how sweetness returns when someone decides to stay. Some mornings the ritual was almost ceremonial. Mary would lift the orange as if it held a small sun, breathe, and set it down. Sometimes Clara would come in and sit in the doorway, hands folded over her knees, watching the little act as if it were a prayer. Marcus learned to keep his hands away from the bowl. He had been the one to replace much with money in the early days, and he had to learn that the true currency here was time and steady presence. Catherine, whose apology had been slow and practical, began to leave a note beside the fruit, a short, clumsy sentence about learning. The notes were small offerings of language, a way to show that remorse could be domestic and ordinary. The neighborhood adjusted to them as seasons do, with a mix of curiosity and, eventually, indifference. Children who had once followed Mary at a distance grew accustomed to her laugh and the way she climbed onto the low wall to tell a story. Mrs. Chen still swept her stoop with meticulous care, but when Mary walked by with a paper bag of oranges, she sometimes found an extra one on her own kitchen table later in the day, left as if by accident, and always with the same careful intent, a neighbor's small insurance against forgetting. Mary grew. She grew physically, thinness filling out into a sturdy frame, and she grew into language, into a way of naming small injustices and asking for repair without storming. At school, she learned to file assignments and to keep a calendar. She also learned how to sit with other children's griefs, how to be still when friends needed to cry. There were teachers who recognized the past in the way she flinched sometimes at loud voices, and others who only saw the girl who remembered to bring extra fruit to share. Where the adults around her once moved either to protect or to avoid, they now found a balance, to keep eyes open but not to take over. Marcus discovered that being present could be a daily labor as demanding as anything he had once paid others to do. He attended meetings and support groups and slowly let his voice be shaped less by defense than by testimony.
On nights when the house was quiet and the parlor's photographs glinted like two small moons, he would sit at the table and make lists. Lists of things he had to say, things he had to do. Catherine made lists too, practical ones. Appointments to arrange, registry forms to fill, reimbursements to offer. Her recompense was not the dramatic display people sometimes expected. It was the slow, inconvenient work of showing up. For therapy sessions, for sessions with a mediator, for a weekly visit to the clinic where Clara now helped fold bandages into neat squares and encouraged others who came in with a soft, steady voice. The daily work did not make the past vanish. There were nights when Mary woke from a dream and dragged the sheets over her head, heart pounding with the old fear that someone would take her away or make her invisible. But now she had places to go with that fear. A living room where Clara would rub her back. A counselor whose office smelled of tea. Friends whose presence was a steadying force. Fear, once an uninvited architect, became only one of the builders in the house, and it had to be negotiated, not obeyed. At 15, Mary began to write. Not the sort of private lists Marcus kept, but long, careful pages. Letters she never sent. Essays for school where she had to explain themes like identity and belonging. Poems that were stark and small and honest. She wrote about the photograph, about the woman who smiled in the older image with a hand lifted in a way Mary now recognized as the way mothers steady a child on a step. She wrote about oranges, their weight, the way their skins gave a faint resistance to the fingernail, the smell that made her think of both sunlight and memory. Her teachers praised the clarity of her voice. Some classmates asked if they could read what she had written, and she would give them a page or two, and then take it back, as if lending someone a part of herself, and then retrieving it. There were awards and small honors, scholarships that insisted she give 3 paragraphs about resilience. But Mary measured triumph in quieter ways. She measured it when Clara laughed in a coughless fit and wiped tears with the back of her hand. She measured it when Catherine left a note that said, "I watched you plant rosemary this morning. You are better at gentleness than I ever was," and did not explain further. She measured it in the way Marcus learned to hear rather than to answer, how his sentences shortened and his apologies lengthened. Outside the house, the story took on its own life. Some people told versions that turned neatly toward blame, and others toward conquest. He gave money, or she apologized, as if any summary could hold the slow accumulation of days.
A journalist came once, curious about the photograph and the two images on the wall, and wrote a piece that made the family at once sympathetic and exposed.
Mary read it with a hard, anxious attention, and then went to the window and watched the street. The world felt both bigger and less private afterward. There were letters, some kind, some legal. There were petitions that came with inked promises, and there were bureaucratic demands that required patience. Through it all, the photograph remained a hinge. Visitors who came to the door often paused there. An aunt who had once been estranged and now stood with arms folded, unsure how to enter. A neighbor who had previously looked away but now stood and offered a casserole. The father of a boy Mary had once played with, who brought an apology handmade with a clumsy attempt at penmanship. The photograph invited people to see, to consider, the before and after that lives tend to insist upon. It did not perform miracles, it made seeing unavoidable. Mary's adolescence carried with it moments of awkwardness that were only partly about the old story. She had crushes and rejections, friendships that cracked and mended. She tried on different selves, the one who laughed loudly at parties, the one who read late into the night, the one who planted orange seeds in a jar and watched them sprout into tentative greens on the windowsill. Marcus and Catherine could not shelter her from ordinary teenage ache, nor would she have wanted them to. But their presence, steady, attentive, sometimes awkward, made the ache less solitary. There came a summer when the city decided to refurbish the block. New paint went up on shutters, and a small mural appeared across from the house, a bright, abstract swirl that children used as a backdrop for their photographs. The changes were mostly cosmetic, and sometimes felt like a soft threat. Paint could cover a history the same way a new story might bury the old. The family watched the scaffolding and the painters, and Marcus found himself curious about the men who hoisted ladders. One of them, a young man named Luis, asked about the oranges he saw on the table each morning. He listened without interruption when Mary told him, plainly and without flourish, why they mattered. He nodded, and then, a week later, left a crate of citrus at the gate with a small hand-lettered note, "For the ritual." Not everyone warmed. There was a neighbor, Mr. Lang, whose face seemed built for disapproval, who complained about the visitors who came and left without contributing to the neighborhood fund. He wrote a letter to the association about privacy and public image, and Marcus sat with the letter in his hands and thought about the many ways families try to keep shame invisible. Marcus wrote back, slowly, acknowledging each point and then making an offer. A community meeting where anyone could speak. To some, his offer was naive. To others, it was necessary. In the meeting that followed, people listened. They did not all agree, but some did ask questions that cut through rumor. Catherine, who stood at the edge of the room with her hair pinned back, surprised herself by speaking. Not a grand speech, but a straightforward account of what she had done and what she had learned. Her voice was not the same as Marcus's. Where he offered restitution, she offered detail and craft. The meeting did not erase years of suspicion, but it shifted the air. Mary watched that meeting like a witness to a small miracle. She felt protective and wary at once. After the room cleared, an older woman came up to her and touched her hand. "You are steady," the woman said. "You make things easier to forgive." Mary could not say whether the woman meant it as praise or an observation. She only felt gratitude for the touch. As Mary moved toward the end of high school, decisions arrived with a weight that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future. Scholarships meant choices about where to study. Friendships required new loyalties. There was a field of study she considered, something with words and law, perhaps, an attempt to harness the power of language that had once been used against her into a tool for rescue. Marcus watched her pack boxes with a fierce pride that sometimes frightened him. It was the look of a man who had once removed obstacles with checks and now had to accept the slow crafting of another life. Clara, whose health had stabilized, took to the garden with a devotion that surprised everyone. She learned about pruning and compost, about the patient work of returning life to soil. People came to buy herbs in small bouquets, and Clara would wrap them in paper with a careful hand. The garden became, in its own practical way, a place of offering. Catherine would stand by the fence and talk with customers, sometimes about recipes, sometimes about things that did not speech. The house, which had once felt like an enclosure of shame, opened gradually toward the street. Sometimes that openness felt unsafe, but more often it felt like repair in action. There were moments that tested the new equilibrium. One autumn afternoon, a man arrived at the gate carrying a file. He was a cousin of someone from Mary's past, he said, and he wanted to ask questions. His voice was gentle and insistent. Mary felt the old nerves tighten, but she also felt the muscles she had built over the years. How to ask for time, how to call Clara or Marcus for support. They met in the kitchen and talked in that slow way that reconstructs trust. Facts, names, propositions, a demand for clarity. The meeting produced another letter and a promise of further inquiry. It was a reminder that the legal and the personal can be braided together, and that no amount of domestic ritual makes for absolute closure. Then came the day the town celebrated its bicentennial, a small festival with stringed lights and tables of food. The neighborhood turned into a corridor of smells and voices.
Mary foi a guiada e instruções para a síntese de fala. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era Wood turned into a corridor of smells and voices. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Mary was asked to speak at a small table where community members told short stories of the block. She accepted, not because she liked public speaking, she did not, but because she had thoughts about belonging she wanted to offer. The parlor photographs were propped on a folding easel beside the table, and the bowl of oranges sat nearby like a quiet theology. When she spoke, her voice was not theatrical. She told the simple truth of what she had learned, that belonging had to be earned and given at the same time, that apologies had to be accompanied by action, that small daily agreements carried the handrails for larger repairs. People listened. Some cried. When she finished, a child in the audience, one of the fruit sellers from the corner, walked up and tucked a small orange into Mary's hand. The gesture was old and new and entirely right. The applause was small. The photograph saw it all, and in the light it seemed less like a relic and more like a witness. Mary walked down the street afterward, clutching the fruit, and felt the strange, steady buoyancy that follows an offering well made. She did not know then that the festival would be the pivot for another chapter, that a stranger in the crowd had recognized the woman in the older photograph from a long-ago charity appeal, and that an inquiry would be reopened. She only knew the weight of the orange and the feel of a hand warm against hers.
It was in that warmth that Mary realized rituals were both private and contagious. They could be shared and could, in the sharing, become a kind of public covenant. She walked towards the gate where Marcus and Catherine were standing like two sentries of a domestic peace. And for a moment the world narrowed to the small brightness at her palm. Then someone called her name from across the street, a voice she knew but had not seen in years. And the street seemed to hold its breath, as if asking whether the life they had built would again be tested. Mary turned. The person who had called was an old friend from the first days, a boy who had once traded marbles and whispered secrets through fences. He was older now, his hair touched with gray, and in his hand he held a camera. He raised it and hesitated, then lowered it with a look that was part apology and part prayer. "Do you mind?" he began. And Mary, with the practiced steadiness of someone who had learned to answer life without flinching, smiled and said, "No, not at all." They walked towards the small cluster of people as the last lights of evening went up, and the photograph in the parlor watched as the house, once a safe for secrets, became a place where the light could come in and be counted. The street hummed with the small noises of community, laughter, the clink of dishes, the distant music of the fair. And Mary felt that the ritual of the orange, the ritual of the photograph, and the ritual of attendance had braided themselves into something neither perfect nor entirely fragile.
"People heard what?" Catherine asked before Mary could answer. The question hung plain and bright, a bell. Tom's gaze flicked between them. "Years ago, there was a fundraising appeal. I remember the flyer. The photograph was used. It helped. But a few months after, some donations were unaccounted for. The charity changed hands. I heard talk, and then nothing. He shrugged. A few of us never forgot. Someone found your name while trying to close an old file. The charity's auditors have asked questions again. They want to know what you remember." Mary's first thought was pragmatic. People find things, files surface, names reappear. Her second thought, quieter and slower, was the small orange in the bowl. Rituals did not only cleanse, they could also make visible what had been hidden by time and habit. "Do they want to speak to me?" she asked. "Yes," Tom said. "Tomorrow, at the community hall. They said they'd understand if you wanted someone with you." Marcus exhaled, the sound like a small departure. "I'll go," he said, before Mary could refuse. His voice had a steadiness that sometimes governed the house and sometimes trembled at its edges. Catherine reached across and took his hand, as if to prove both to him and to herself that she could. Mary looked at them both. She thought of the photograph. Not only the woman in it, but the way its edges had softened, the corners worn by hands. She thought of the orange, its skin bright and slightly rough under her palm, the bowl of them like a promise. She had learned how to make offerings that were not theatrical but necessary. She had learned, too, the peculiar bravery of being present. "Will they make accusations?" she asked. "I don't know," Tom said. "They said they only want testimonies. They said they want to understand the paper trail. But," he hesitated, embarrassed by his own caution, "people will talk. If you go, people will talk more." Mary nodded. She understood the cost. She also understood what silence did, preserved comfort at the expense of truth. There were things that could only be stood in, not skirted. "All right," she said, "I'll come." It was not a heroic decision. It was an arrangement of ordinary courage, the kind that looks like a woman putting one foot on a step and trusting it will hold. Marcus's face softened with a relief that was almost gratitude. Catherine's hand trembled against his. Tom smiled, small and tentative. "I'll come too," he said, "if that's all right." "Yes," Mary said, "come." They spoke for a while after that, about the festival, about the photographs placed on the mantel, about the neighbors who had stopped by during the day with small remedies and gossip. The air in the room thinned into a companionable quiet. Outside, the night continued its gentle work of folding the street into sleep. When Tom rose to leave, he lingered by the mantel. He looked at the 2 photographs, then at Mary. "May I take another?" he asked.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "and a second orange in the bowl beside the first". Esta é a conclusão. Aumente a emoção para o nível máximo, mantendo a potência, e termine com uma pausa solene e impactante. It was not an answer to everything, but it was a beginning. Outside, a car door shut softly down the road. Inside, the house exhaled. The night settled around them like a cloth, careful and watchful. Tomorrow, the world would ask its questions. Tonight, they kept the vigil of ordinary people who had decided at last to speak.